The funeral home smelled of lilies and old grievances. I stood in the corner of the ornate viewing room, watching my sisters Victoria and Eleanor hold court like queens receiving tribute. Black Armani suits, perfect makeup despite their supposed grief, and that familiar air of superiority that had defined my childhood. I'm Diana Matthews, though they insisted on calling me Little D well into my 30s. At 34 I was the youngest of 3 daughters, the one who'd supposedly inherited none of our father's business acumen or our mother's social graces. The family disappointment who'd chosen social work over law, who drove a 10-year-old Subaru instead of leasing luxury cars, who lived in a modest duplex while they maintained mansions in the hills. If only they knew what I'd been building in secret. Mother's mahogany casket dominated the center of the room, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. She'd passed peacefully in her sleep at 72, leaving behind a carefully curated legacy of charity galas and country club memberships. What she'd also left behind was a will that would finally reveal how my sisters truly saw me. Diana, Victoria approached, her heels clicking against the marble floor. At 38 she was the eldest and had always acted like it gave her authority over everything and everyone. Her husband Marcus stood behind her, radiating that particular smugness of old money married to new arrogance. The viewing ends in an hour, she continued, then we need to discuss arrangements. Arrangements. That's what they'd been calling the will reading for weeks. As if my inheritance was just another detail to be managed efficiently. Eleanor joined us, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving despite the humidity. At 36 she'd perfected the art of looking concerned while calculating advantages. Her husband James nodded gravely, probably already planning how to invest whatever windfall was coming their way. We've spoken with Harrison, Blackwell and Associates, Eleanor said, referring to the family's longtime law firm. The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Just family, of course. I nodded quietly, sipping water from a plastic cup while they held crystal glasses of wine. They'd made it clear that even at our mother's funeral, there were still hierarchies to maintain. You know, Marcus spoke up, his voice carrying that condescending tone I'd heard at family gatherings for years. It might be wise to manage expectations about the inheritance. What Marcus means, Victoria translated, though I'd understood perfectly, is that mother was very specific about rewarding success and responsibility. Success and responsibility. Code words for Diana gets nothing. The truth was I'd seen this coming for years. Every family dinner where they discussed their latest acquisitions while I talked about my nonprofit work. Every holiday where they exchanged expensive gifts while I brought homemade cookies. Every birthday where they boasted about their children's private schools while I mentioned the public school students I mentored. They'd written me off as the bleeding heart who'd never amount to anything financially. And I'd let them. Because while they were busy spending inherited money and living off trust funds, I'd been building something they never expected. Something that would shake our family's foundation tomorrow morning. The next day arrived gray and drizzly, matching the mood as we gathered in the conference room of Harrison, Blackwell and Associates. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of downtown's most prestigious building, all dark wood and intimidating portraits of founding partners. Robert Harrison himself would be reading the will. At 65 he'd been the family lawyer for decades, present at every major financial decision since Dad's death 5 years ago. He sat at the head of the polished conference table, manila folders arranged precisely before him. Victoria and Marcus took seats on one side, Eleanor and James on the other. I sat alone at the foot of the table, isolated as always. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Before we begin, Robert cleared his throat, I want to express my condolences again. Your mother was an extraordinary woman who built a remarkable legacy. A legacy that included 3 luxury properties, a portfolio of investments, and the controlling interest in Matthews and Associates, the boutique consulting firm Dad had founded. Conservative estimates put the estate at around $15 million. Not billionaire money, but enough to ensure my sister's comfort for life. Now, Robert opened the first folder, your mother's will is quite detailed. She wanted to ensure her wishes were perfectly clear. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Eleanor's manicured fingers drummed silently against the mahogany table. Their husbands tried to look appropriately solemn while practically counting dollar signs. To my daughter Victoria, Robert began reading, I leave the Beacon Hill townhouse, valued at approximately $2.3 million, along with the associated furnishings and my collection of antique jewelry. Victoria smiled, a satisfied curve of perfectly glossed lips. The townhouse had been in our family for 3 generations. To my daughter Eleanor I leave the Martha's Vineyard estate, valued at approximately $1.8 million, along with the yacht Serendipity and my art collection. Eleanor squeezed James's hand under the table. The Vineyard house was where we'd spent childhood summers, where Eleanor had always claimed she'd raise her own children someday. Robert paused, looking directly at me. To my daughter Diana. Here it came. The charitable remainder trust with restrictions. Maybe a small cash gift with conditions about how it could be spent. Something that would keep me grateful but dependent. I leave my love, my pride, and my apologies for not understanding sooner what she was truly building. The room went silent. That wasn't the usual language of inheritance law. What does that mean? Victoria demanded. Where's her portion? Robert continued reading. I leave Diana nothing from my estate because she has already surpassed anything I could give her. The documents in her possession will explain everything. All eyes turned to me. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it calmly on the table. I was wondering when we'd get to this part, I said quietly. Victoria's face reddened. What are you talking about? Documents? What documents? I opened the folder, revealing property deeds, corporate filings and financial statements. All bearing official seals, all completely legal, all absolutely real. Well, I began, since we're discussing inheritance, let me show you what I've been inheriting. I slid the first document across the table. A property deed dated 18 months ago. Eleanor grabbed it, her eyes scanning frantically. This says you own the Beacon Hill townhouse. I do, I confirmed. Bought it from Dad's estate when he needed liquid assets for his cancer treatment. He didn't want to burden you two with the financial stress, so we kept the transaction private. Victoria snatched the paper. That's impossible. Mother lived there. We have keys. You have keys because I allowed it. Check the deed. Diana Matthews, sole owner. I've been your landlord for over a year. Marcus looked like he might be having a stroke. But the inheritance. I slid another document across. The Martha's Vineyard estate. Also mine. Purchased 2 years ago when Dad's consulting firm hit a rough patch. Again kept private to avoid family drama. James stared at the deed. But Eleanor's getting the house in the will. Eleanor's getting a house I own, I corrected. Mother couldn't leave what she didn't have. Robert Harrison was reading the documents with increasing amazement. As the family lawyer, he'd been kept in the dark about these transactions at Dad's specific request. Diana, he said slowly, these are all legitimate. When did I what? I pulled out another folder. When did I acquire the financial means to buy multimillion-dollar properties? When did I develop the business acumen you all assumed I lacked? When did I become successful enough to bail out the family fortune without anyone noticing? I opened the second folder, revealing corporate documents. Matthews and Associates? I'm the silent partner who saved it from bankruptcy 3 years ago. I own 60% of the company now. Eleanor's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. But you're a social worker. You make $45,000 a year. I make $45,000 a year from social work, I clarified. That's my hobby. My actual job is running Compass Holdings, a private equity firm specializing in distressed asset acquisition and restructuring. I pulled out the next document. Annual revenue last year, $127 million. Personal net worth as of this morning, $43 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's perfect composure cracked. Marcus loosened his tie like it was choking him. Eleanor stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. But how? Victoria whispered. When? We would have known. I smiled sadly. You would have known if you'd ever asked. If you'd shown interest in my life beyond pitying me. But you were too busy assuming I was a failure. I pulled out my laptop, opening a presentation I'd prepared for this moment. Compass Holdings started 8 years ago with a $50,000 inheritance from Grandma Rose. Remember her? The one whose funeral you all skipped because it wasn't prestigious enough. The laptop screen showed a timeline of acquisitions. Property after property, company after company, all bought strategically over the years. While you were spending trust fund money on luxury cars and country club memberships, I was learning. MBA at night school. Series 7 license. Real estate certification. Building relationships with distressed property owners who needed fast, cash solutions. Robert leaned forward, studying the documents. Diana, this is extraordinary. You've essentially been supporting the family estate for years without them knowing. Supporting and protecting, I agreed. Dad was proud but worried. His medical bills were enormous. The consulting firm was struggling in the recession. He didn't want his daughters to know how close we came to losing everything. I clicked to the next slide. So we made a deal. I'd quietly acquire the properties and keep them in the family. He'd maintain appearances while getting the medical care he needed. Everyone stayed comfortable and the family name remained untarnished. Victoria found her voice. But the wills. Mother's will. It says we inherit. You inherit properties I own, I finished. Mother knew the truth. The will is her way of forcing this conversation. Of making you understand what really happened while you thought I was failing. I stood up, walking to the window overlooking the city. You see, I learned something important from watching this family. Real wealth isn't about appearances or status symbols. It's about value creation, strategic thinking, and sometimes about making sacrifices others won't understand. Eleanor finally spoke. What does this mean for us? I turned back to face them. It means you have choices to make. I returned to the table, pulling out one final set of documents. These are new lease agreements for both properties. Fair market rate, standard terms. You can stay in the homes you've always known, just as paying tenants instead of inheritors. Marcus's face purpled. You're charging us rent? For our own family homes. They're not your family homes, I said calmly. They're my properties. But I'm offering you reasonable terms because I believe in family, even when family doesn't believe in me. I opened another folder. Or, if you prefer, here are sale agreements. I'll sell each property back to you at current market value. The Beacon Hill house is now worth $3.2 million. The Vineyard estate is $2.6 million. Plus improvements and maintenance costs I've invested over the years. James was frantically calculating on his phone. We don't have that kind of liquid capital. I know, I said simply. That's why I'm offering the lease option. Victoria slammed her hand on the table. This is extortion. You can't just steal our inheritance. I haven't stolen anything, I replied. I saved it. When Dad was facing bankruptcy from medical bills, when the consulting firm was failing, when this family's financial foundation was cracking, I stepped in. Quietly. Efficiently. Without asking for credit or recognition. I pulled out bank statements showing the transactions. Here's the $890,000 I paid for Dad's cancer treatment that insurance didn't cover. Here's the $1.2 million I invested to save Matthews and Associates. Here's the $400,000 in property maintenance and improvements over the past 3 years. Robert was reviewing everything with increasing amazement. Diana, you've essentially been the family's anonymous benefactor for years. Not anonymous to Dad, I said softly. He knew. He was grateful. And he was proud, even if he couldn't say so publicly without revealing how close we came to losing everything. I sat back down, looking at my sisters' shocked faces. Here's what I propose. We can continue as we have been. You live in the properties, I maintain ownership, and we all pretend nothing has changed. Or we can acknowledge reality and move forward honestly. Eleanor wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were a failure? I finished. Because you needed to think that. It made you feel secure in your own choices. And honestly, it gave me cover to work without interference. I pulled out business cards, placing them on the table. But now you know. Diana Matthews, CEO of Compass Holdings. The sister you dismissed is the one who's been keeping this family afloat. Victoria picked up the card, staring at it like it might burst into flames. What happens now? Now you decide what kind of family we want to be going forward, I said. One based on honest relationships and mutual respect, or one based on pretense and resentment. I gathered my documents. The lease agreements are valid for 72 hours. After that, I'll need to make other arrangements for the properties. As I reached the door, Eleanor called out, "Diana, wait." I turned back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small. "We've been horrible to you. Condescending and dismissive. You were building an empire while we were— what were we doing? Living off inherited money and looking down on the person who was actually earning it," I said, not unkindly. "But that can change if you want it to." Victoria stood up slowly. "What would you want from us? I mean, if we wanted to repair this." I smiled for the first time that day. Honesty. Respect. And maybe, for once, to be invited to family gatherings as an equal instead of a charity case. Marcus cleared his throat. "And the properties?" "Are my properties," I said firmly. "But they can continue being your homes. I believe in family even when family has trouble believing in me." I left them there, stunned and silent, while Robert explained the legal implications of everything they'd just learned. 3 days later, I received 2 signed lease agreements and a third document I hadn't expected: a formal request for Eleanor to join Compass Holdings as Vice President of Property Management. Apparently, she'd done some soul-searching about her own abilities and interests. Victoria took longer to come around, but eventually called to ask about investment opportunities for her and Marcus. They wanted to learn, she said. To understand how I'd built something real instead of just inheriting it. The family dinners that followed were different. Awkward at first, but gradually more honest. They asked about my work, really asked, and listened to the answers. I learned about their struggles too. The pressure they'd felt to maintain appearances, the fear that they weren't as capable as everyone assumed. 6 months later, we were all seated around the dining table at the Beacon Hill house, my house, where they paid rent, but I'd given them full autonomy over decorating and lifestyle choices. Eleanor had proven surprisingly talented at property management, increasing our portfolio's value by 15% in her first quarter. Victoria had started her own consulting practice, using connections from Matthews and Associates but building her own client base. "You know," Victoria said over dessert, "I used to think inheritance was about getting money from family. And now?" I asked. She smiled, a genuine expression I hadn't seen from her in years. "Now I think it's about what you build with the family you have." Eleanor raised her wine glass. "To Diana. For saving us from ourselves even when we didn't deserve it." I raised my water glass. "Some habits die hard. To family. The kind you choose to be, not the kind you inherit." As we toasted, I looked around the table at these women who'd once dismissed me, who now treated me as an equal, who'd learned that success isn't about where you start but what you build along the way. The documents that had shocked them that day in the lawyer's office were framed now in my own office downtown. Not as trophies but as reminders. Reminders that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that you can build something meaningful, even when no one believes you can. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you can use that success to build something even more valuable. A family based on respect instead of assumptions, on reality instead of pretense. The girl they'd called Little D was gone. In her place was Diana Matthews, CEO, property owner, and finally, truly their equal.